Well, the Apostle Paul said, don't respond in kind. Don't repay evil for evil, but repay evil for good, and in so doing, heap coals of fire on their head. So I'm just going to pour the whole pot of coffee on his head. Yeah. Now that you've had your T-bone steak, we're going to go back to bologna. So, if you'd like to turn to Psalm chapter 34. Psalm chapter 34. Appreciate Jansen's lesson and the work that he did on that. He did that at home. He did a great job. I just texted my wife and said he knocked it out of the park. And I appreciate the work that he did. Appreciate you so much for having us this weekend and for your consideration of all things you're doing for he and Lucy. It's not just Jansen that's here. Lucy's here too. And so she is a vital part of that relationship and vital part that makes that work. Psalm 34 is, to me, a very powerful psalm, and there's a background for why that's the case for me. Several years ago, I was going through a very dark period of time in my life for several reasons. And I was visiting in Branson, Missouri, and they were studying the Psalms that morning, and they were studying Psalm 34. And given what my mindset was like that day, Psalm 34 struck me and wasn't the answer to me. I went home and then began to diligently work through the psalm. And I think there are some things that are the background of this psalm that are true of David as well. This psalm is really not a psalm that is instructional as much as it is a psalm that's devotional. It's the kind of psalm that you might think about and talk about if you're just sitting across the table from someone drinking a cup of coffee. Or maybe you're at the restaurant and you're talking with someone and you're talking about something that's just devotional and something that has passion for you. That's this kind of psalm. And while it is devotional, there's still quite a bit of instruction that's here for us. The background of this psalm, I think, is very powerful. Not all psalms do we have the background to them, but this one we do. David has just conquered the giant. And you remember when Saul made the promise to whoever slays Goliath, basically, from the book of Rickie, will give him the whole kingdom. And on top of that, he'll get my daughter as a wife. And so David slays the giant. Saul doesn't pay up on everything that he does. He does get Saul's daughter as his wife, and that is a plague to him throughout most of his life. But as they go back after the victory, they're coming through the town, parading through the victory, and the chorus goes, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his 10,000s. Saul probably at this time is somewhere in the area of 60 years old. Jonathan's probably in his 40s at this time. David is probably maybe top end of his teens, maybe early 20s at this time is a speculated thought. Here is Saul, who's a king, who's head and shoulders above everybody, but is tremendously impatient because he wouldn't wait for Samuel to come to Gilgal. Blew himself out of the water almost immediately in the time of being king. So he's already been rejected. David's going to be the king in prospect. And now he kills the giant, and now people are singing David's praises. Here's King Saul, who is obviously drunk on his own pride. That is apparent also in 1 Samuel 15, whenever he blames everything that goes wrong on the people as opposed to taking responsibility for having not slain all the Amalekites as God told him to. Here's this older man, and here's this younger man. And the younger man's getting all the praise and all the glory and all the attention. And the older man doesn't like that. And it cannot stand to be in the very arena of David himself. Now, pause button. Sidebar just a moment. Has nothing to do with the story, but has something to do with what I just said. Because there are young men who are very talented in preaching the gospel, And we have a number of young men in our fellowship of people today that are very talented in preaching the gospel. It's not a challenge to the older men who preach the gospel. It's a compliment to the older men who preach the gospel. Because an younger man preaches a sermon in a gospel meeting, and everybody says, with the older man standing there, we've never heard a sermon like that. That's the best sermon. You're the greatest guy I ever heard. Doesn't mean the older man is now to be put out to pasture in the South 40 as though he has nothing to offer either. Because here's the deal. When he goes in a meeting somewhere and he preaches it, that younger man's going to be standing there and they're going to say to the older man, that's the best sermon I ever heard. You're the greatest thing since whatever. No, it's a compliment. I remember years ago, Brother Paul Earnhardt, at that time he's probably in his 60s, I'm in my 30s, he said, I must decrease and you must increase. And that's the way it is. We're always handing the baton off to the next generation. That's true as preachers, that's true as elders, that's true as people who are Christians. But here's Saul who can't stand that, back on point. Here's Saul who can't stand that David is getting the attention. And so, he begins to pursue David. And David begins to run. And David has run so much, so far, he has no food, he has no water, has nothing to provide for himself. His only answer to his problem is to go to, of all places and all people, Gath of Philistia and the king of Gath, the king of the Philistines. To do that, he feigns being a madman, frothing at his mouth, acting as though he is just rabid, like a rabid dog, just frothing at his mouth and just mad. And the king allows him to come in to Gath for a while until the men of Gath see what's taking place. Then they had the king boot David out. But David's answer to run from Saul was not to turn from God, but to turn to the Philistines. You remember the relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites? Philistines didn't just hate Israelites a little bit. They hated Israelites a lot. And now he runs to the enemy for safety instead of running to God. The other thing that's unique about this psalm is how it begins. It begins at the end and then explains why he has said what he said. If we're writing a letter, we say, we don't write letters anymore. If you write an email or text or give a Facebook message, we say, dear, you don't say dear anymore. But if you were to be in the ancient times in the United States of America and write a letter, you would say dear, and you begin to address the person, and you'd save the end for the end, not at the beginning. But here, the psalmist puts the end first. And so the psalmist begins in verse 1, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us always exalt his name. And what you have here in these first three verses is what I call an invitation to worship. If I were to give bullet points to this sermon, this would be the first bullet point. This is a call or invitation to worship. But notice what is said here. The emphasis upon the Lord here, and what the psalmist is what David is telling us here is, don't be surprised that you have troubles. Troubles are always going to be there, but don't begin to think that the troubles are greater than God. God is greater than your greatest problem. Troubles may always be there, but God will not abandon you. God will be there, and he is greater. And so listen how David then kind of works through that. Notice the language that he says. I will bless the Lord. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. Bless, boast, magnify, exalt. Here is David's consideration of God. Here's the conclusion that he's reached. I will boast, I will magnify, I will exalt, I will bless the Lord. Here's his conclusion because of what we're going to experience. This is what I will do. And so what David first of all does is he focuses the attention of worship on God. Again, if we're looking at this as some kind of devotional piece, he's focusing his attention of worship on God. Now, why would I emphasize that? Because in religion today, and if we're not careful, even among our brethren today, we seem to have a very man-centered worship. Worship is not man-centered. Worship is God-centered. Worship is not about are my felt needs met. Worship is about blessing, magnifying, exalting, and boasting about God. God is the audience. God is the center of our worship, not man. Man is not at the center of all worship. David disabuses that here. Something else that we see in this is he gives a time frame to this. I'll bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. David's not operating by the clock here. He's not saying, okay, your worship begins at 9 o'clock Sunday morning, and then you have 10 o'clock Sunday morning and 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon, and that is your time of worship. That's when you come to worship. No, he says, I will bless the Lord, I will praise the Lord, I'll magnify the Lord, I'll exalt the Lord, all the time. Continually I will do that. Continually I will do that. So there's no time reference to this. As far as he is concerned, if there's someone that you love, you want to spend time with that person. And what he's saying is, here is the Lord, and I want to spend time with him all time, continually throughout the way. If there's someone you love and you want to be with, you don't operate by the calendar or by the clock. And what he's saying is, I want to be with him all times. Another thing to notice here is, I will praise him with my mouth. Notice here, this is individual. But then notice, he will say, my soul shall make its boast in the Lord, the humble shall hear of it, and be glad, and magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name forever. Notice, first of all, he says, my soul shall make its boast. Let us exalt the name of the Lord together. So first of all, David looks at it from the standpoint of his own personal relationship, personal worship with God. Someone has well said, this is a paraphrase of what the quote is, that our hearts are prepared individually, and we bring our individual hearts collectively. And as we have prepared our hearts individually, bring them collectively to pour our collective worship and praise out to God. And so here you have David saying, I will what? I will make my soul boast in the Lord. My soul will boast in him. But then he says, let us exalt. This is just a speculative thing I will throw out there, and I emphasize speculative because I don't know that we can nail it down 100%, but it fits the time frame. So I'm just giving this as a possibility. It may be the us that he's talking about are David and his mighty men. Because David is fleeing Saul. And you know, they've been in 2 caves, and both time in the caves, David's had the chance to take Saul's life, but he has said, I will not put my hands or touch God's anointed. So it may be that as David is fleeing, he's not alone fleeing from Saul. It may be that his mighty men are with him too as they flee from Saul. And so he says, let us exalt his name together. Let me see if I can give a sense to that for us and kind of put that in maybe a sense that we could appreciate just a little bit. If you go to a place like the Grand Canyon by yourself, it is still going to be grand. You're going to stand there with your mouth agape, looking at all this creation that God has given there and how God has created. It's just going to be magnificent. You'll say, my soul shall boast in the Lord. That's one thing. But you go to the Grand Canyon with your wife and your kids, and you're standing there at rim's edge, and you're looking out over the canyon, you would say, did you see that? Did you see that? Did you see that? That's what he's saying when he said, let us exalt the name of the Lord together. And it ought to be when we leave our collective worship, having prepared our individual minds, we come together. It ought to be that when we leave our collective time together, we should be able to exalt the Lord together by saying, did you see that? Did you see that? Did you see that? That's what he's saying here. It's one thing to worship the Lord individually. It is totally another thing when we come together collectively and bring our collective hearts together that leaves us with but one expression, let us exalt the Lord together. Did you see that? Did you see that worship? That's what David is saying here, and that's his invitation to worship here. So we move now to why David says all this. In verse 4, if I were to give another bullet point to this, if the first bullet point is an invitation to worship, the second bullet point would be, why worship? Why worship? And so look at what he says in verses 4 through 7. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. Then he looked to him. They looked to him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him and delivers them. First of all, why worship? Because the Lord delivers. Look at the condition. Look at the condition here. He delivered me out of my fears. Well, what are the fears? We just talked about those fears. Saul is after David. Saul is pursuing David. And as he is pursuing David, David is fleeing from him, and David is trying to find the answer for himself. Hold your finger there, put your marker in Psalm 34, and turn to Psalm 56 just a moment. Because Psalm 56 is companion to Psalm 34. And Psalm 56 kind of fills in a blank here for us that goes, when David said that he was fearful, the Lord took care of him in his fear. The Lord delivered him. But look at verse 1, beginning of chapter 56. Be merciful to me, O God, for a man would swallow me up. Fighting all day, he oppresses me. My enemies would hound me all day, for there are many who fight against me, O Most High. Now, if you plug in Saul in there, if David says there's a man who would swallow me, Saul would swallow me up. Saul fights against me, oppresses me every day. And Saul and his mighty men fight against me. Saul is pursuing him, and Saul is fighting against him. Then he says, verse 3, whenever I am afraid, I will turn to Gath of Philistia. That's not what he says. What David is saying is, I finally have learned the lesson to stop trying to fix this and solve this myself. I can't provide the answer. I have failed providing that. I'm still in my fear. It has not delivered me. And so he says then, whenever I am afraid, I will trust in God. In God I will praise His word. In God I put my trust. I will not fear. Notice, what can flesh put in there? What can Saul do to me? So when you turn back to Psalm 34, and he says, I sought the Lord, and He heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. But notice something else that's here. If you look back in verse 2, it says, the humble shall hear of it and be glad. And then he says, verse 6, this poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. Well, the Lord is only going to hear a humble man. The Lord will not hear a proud man. David in his pride tried to solve it. That didn't work. So he says, I will humble myself. I'll be humble before the Lord. And then it says, here is this poor man. I think maybe he's talking about humility there. It may be impoverished materially. But what he's saying is, here is this poor man that cried out, and the Lord heard him. And his response is, I will trust the Lord. I'll put my confidence in Him, and no one can pursue me, and no man can conquer me. As Alan just led, you are my strength. You are my shield. That's what David is saying. You're my strength and my shield, O Lord. But then notice again, he says, the angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear Him and delivers them. Why worship? Because the Lord delivers. Notice the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear Him and deliver him. That expression, angel of the Lord, is really interesting. Just an observation. You can do your research on this. You can disagree with me, that's fine. I give you the right to be wrong. But that expression, angel of the Lord, that appears in the Old Testament like that, is predominantly a reference to the person we come to know as Jesus. The angel of the Lord is the person we come to know as Jesus or the Messiah. The angel of the Lord is the second person of the Godhead. And what he's saying here is the one we come to know, Jesus, that encircles me. But I said that's an interesting phrase, but not just because of that. You remember when you have Elisha and Sennacherib and the Assyrian troops have them pinned back against the gate, and 185,000 Assyrian troops there, and they're about to just slay Elisha and the few people he has. And Elisha's servant looks up and says, those that are against us are those that are greater than those that are with us. And the Lord says, Elisha says to the Lord, please pull back the veil. And the Lord pulls back the veil, and the servant looks and says, those that are with us are greater than those that are against us. And you have Michael as the host or the captain of the Lord's army, leading the army of the Lord's angels, and says, there are more of Michael and his angels fighting for us than there are of the Assyrian troops that are against us. Second, when you go to the book of Jude, there's an interesting couple of verses there. It talks about that Michael wrestled with Satan. Again, that's kind of an interesting thing to contemplate. Michael wrestled with Satan for Moses' body. Why? Well, from the book of Rickie, if we could find Moses' body, we'd have him taxidermied, stuffed in the corner, and we'd bow before him and say, oh, how great Moses is. And what God didn't want us to do was make an idol out of Moses. And nobody knows where his body's at. And Michael won the battle. In the time of Daniel, he's fighting and he prays for Michael to come. And Michael's delayed in his coming. He said, I'm sorry, buddy, I'd have been here 3 days earlier. I was fighting the king of Persia. That's not the king of Persia. That is the army of the angels, of the demons of Persia. And what Michael is saying there, I've been fighting them. I was delayed just a little bit. I'll come take care of you, and I got to get right back. Michael was leading the army against the demons that were there, and he was victorious. Michael hasn't lost a battle yet. And as the captain of the Lord's army, with the second person of the Godhead leading the way, we will not be defeated. And what he's saying is, I was delivered from the angel of the Lord. Someone can ask me, how does that work? As soon as you can tell me and explain to me the wind, I'll explain how that works. I don't know how that works. There's some things we just have to accept by faith. That's the story. That's the narrative. He said, the angel of the Lord delivered me. And then notice the results of this. He says in verse 5, they looked to him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. They looked to him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. They looked to him and they were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. I've had the pleasure of doing a number of weddings through the years. And it's always fascinating to me that you can have this big old boy, and he stands there to my left, and you would think that big old boy, you couldn't punch him in the face and make him cry. And the moment his to-be bride crest makes the turn of the corner, and he sees her in all her radiance on her father's arm. Almost without fail, every time, he breaks down in tears because he sees the radiance of his bride. And he's not ashamed. It may not be her most beautiful moment in life. There may be other moments, but at this moment, here's her most radiant moment, and he is overwhelmed by this, and by her radiance, and his face is not ashamed. This is his bride, and he cannot contain himself. And so David says, their faces were not ashamed because they looked on him and were radiant. Now, if we just stop the psalm there, could you see now why David would say, I will bless, I will boast, I'll magnify, I'll praise, I'll exalt? Because of that invitation, because of why the Lord has delivered us. If I come to verse 8, and I would give a third bullet point to this. I would begin to say, not only does the Lord deliver, but we worship because the Lord provides. We worship because the Lord provides. And look at what he says in verse 8. Oh, taste and see the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him. That's Psalm 55. Oh, fear the Lord, you his saints. There's no want to those who fear him. The young lions lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. Notice how it begins here. Taste and see the Lord is good. How do you do that? Do you get your knife and fork out? How do you taste and see the Lord is good? Well, the little word taste is a little problematic for us. In Mark chapter 9, in verse 1, you have the same expression in the New Testament that's here. And the Lord said, there's some standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in power. There's some standing here who shall not experience death until they see the Son of Man coming in power. And what David is saying here is, experience the Lord and see that he is good. May I make an observation about something as I work with that with you? I think it is vitally, vitally important that we understand how we are to understand God's Word. I think we need to continually teach command, example, necessary inference, generic authority, specific authority, all those things that go with law of harmony, all things that go with how you understand communication. And by the way, those are not just simple Bible things. That's how you understand communication. But there's something else we can't miss. We can't also miss experiencing the Lord. You know, there's a song we sing, have you ever stood at the ocean and seen the billowing waves? If I were writing that song, and I don't write songs, I'd add one more at the end. Have you ever seen the pristine purity of a newborn's face? If you have seen Jesus my Lord. When you see that newborn, you have experienced the Lord. When you see that bow in the sky, you have experienced the Lord. When you see two people struggle and conquer, you have experienced the Lord. When you've stood at the Grand Canyon in all of His glory, you have experienced the Lord. When you've come together and worship and say, did you see that? You have experienced the Lord. Right alongside with how we understand communication, we need to also understand the need to experience God in everything we do and see His presence and taste and see that He is good. But I fear we've become so pointed on one side, we've lost the balance of the other side of experiencing Him. I hope this weekend when it's over, you can say, we experienced the Lord, and not be ashamed to say that. Again, I told you the background of this psalm for me. And I had to learn to experience the Lord, to really appreciate who He is, because the same God that communicates with us one way says, I want you to use your imagination When you come to the book of Revelation, command, example, necessary inference do not work. What God is saying is, for this moment, I want you to suspend that, and I want you to open your mind. I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine, as he says in chapters 4 and chapter 5, I want you to imagine the throne scene. In chapters 21 and 22, I want you to imagine that tree that is set with rivers flowing on both sides. And God being there and wiping away every tear. I want you to imagine that the light is so bright, there'll never be a need for sunshine. Can you see that? Can you experience that? That's what he's saying when he says, taste and see the Lord is good. Notice who he's talking to here. He's talking about those who taste, those who trust, those who fear, those who seek, verse 10. But there's something else that he says here. There's no want to those who fear. The young lions lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. Did you get that? Who's the king of the jungle? The lion. Who always gets to eat? The king of the jungle. If the young lions, who are in their strength and youth, they lack hunger, God's people won't. God's people, he says, shall not lack any good thing. Do you see how the Lord provides? That's why we worship. But then coming to verse 11. If I were to give this as a bullet point, I would say how to come or how to know God. First is the invitation to worship. The second is why worship. The Lord delivers, the Lord provides. And then this is how to come or how to come to or how to know God. Come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. He says, come, you children. I don't think he's talking about the little ones. I don't think he's talking about the little ones. You know, Matthew chapter 18, the young children came to Jesus and the disciples said, oh, no, the Lord doesn't have time for y'all. Y'all go away. And the Lord said, no, leave them here. Then he says, whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble, that's not the kids. That's a disciple. In Matthew chapter 11 and verse 25, he will talk about that the wise and the prudent won't get what he's saying because what he's saying is for babes. What he's saying is for those who are teachable. So when he talks about children, he's talking about those who are teachable. So he will say here, come you children, listen to me, I will teach you. Children are teachable. And so he's saying, you have this attribute, you be teachable, you come to the Lord and be taught. Who is the man who desires life and loves many days, that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil, your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. Who is the man who desires life, that he may see many good days and do good? How do you do that? You keep your tongue from evil. You say good things. Even when someone says, now you get to hear a real sermon. You speak well of, you do good to, and you pray for that person. He said, you speak well of them. Watch what you say. Guard your tongue. There's bars there called teeth. You guard your tongue and don't speak evil things. You ever had the experience having had a conversation the previous day or previous days with someone, it didn't go well? And it's just been rolling in your mind. I mean, it's been chewing you up. You wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and you think, man, I wish I hadn't said that. Maybe it was your wife, maybe it was your kids, maybe it's somebody else. Man, I wish I hadn't said that. He said, don't speak that way. Don't speak evil like that. There was a lady that came to the preacher. This has got to be a preacher story. After he taught on using your talents, she came to the preacher and said, I think I have identified my talents. He said, well, sister, what is that? She said, my talent is telling everybody where they're wrong. He said, I think that's one the Lord wouldn't mind if you buried. Well, we can be quick to tell each other we're wrong, but are we quick to praise one another? And so he says, what do you do? You keep your tongue from speaking. Number 2, depart from evil and do good. At the end, the Lord's not going to ask me how big is my library. He's not going to ask me how many miles you have on your F-150. He's not going to say, how big was your house? What he's going to know is, did you do people good? Did you do someone good today? Did you do someone good in their life? Did you do somebody good? And then he's going to say, seek peace and pursue it. And by the way, Peter uses these things in 1 Peter chapter 3, and they're put in the form of injunctions, commands. And what he's saying is, here is the command. You don't speak this way, you do good, and you seek peace and pursue it. Now, we'll fight tooth and toenail to say, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, and we won't let anybody take that from us. But when he says, seek peace and pursue it, oh, that's okay. We don't have to do that. No, that's as much a command as Mark 16:16. And what he's saying there is, I have to be a peace seeker with people. To do good to people and speak well of them, I have to pursue peace. That doesn't mean it's an expense of compromise. Love rejoices not in iniquity, love rejoices in truth. There's your balance. But even in the end, I take the initiative to seek peace and give honor to others first. Romans chapter 12. And so he says, this is how you come to the Lord. But now then finally, here's the conclusion. Before we get to the conclusion of my points to get there. Notice the blessings. The eyes of the Lord over the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. He hears. Notice earlier in the text it said, the Lord heard me. I sought the Lord, verse 4, and the Lord heard me. Lord who? The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. The God who created this world, the God who spoke all these things into existence. He said his ears are open to our cry. Did we get that? The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Israel, the God who sent his Son to save our souls, his ears are open to our cry. Wow! Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever tasted that? Did you see that? Have you seen that? And then he says, the face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears, and delivers them out of all their troubles. Not only does the Lord hear, the Lord delivers. He's not going to say, okay, he's going to throw us in the deep end and say, swim if you can. If you can't, that's just tough on you. No. If he gave us his own Son, the greater gift, will he not give us the lesser gifts, what we shall eat, what we shall drink, and what we shall wear? And then he says, verse 19, many are the affliction of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of them all. He guards all his bones, not one of them shall be broken. Does that last part there ring a bell to you anywhere? He guards all his bones, not one of them shall be broken. Speaking of Christ. And what he's saying there is, Satan's not going to defeat you. Satan didn't defeat Christ, and Satan's not going to defeat you. And then he said finally, the Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who trust in him shall be condemned. What a blessing. None of those who trust in him shall be condemned. And so David's conclusion is this. I'll bless the Lord at all times. I'll praise. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make his boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Oh, let us exalt the Lord together. What David is saying is, I finally learned. I can't run from Saul and find my answer with the Philistines. And running from Saul, I have to run to the Lord. And he will not allow harm to come upon me. Because those who trust in the Lord will not condemn. Now, this is not a panacea in life under the sun that says, okay, you're never going to suffer loss in your life. You're never going to have adverse things happen to you in your life. You're never going to have a significant loss in your life as a child or a parent or loved one somewhere along the way. That's not what this is saying. The blessings are found in the Lord from the standpoint of coming to know him in a spiritual way. David said, I can't find these in the material world, but I find these with the Lord. And I hope we all find that. So I'll just ask you at the end here, did you see that? Did you see that? Did you experience the Lord? And if so, are our faces radiant and without shame? You know what's wonderful about the Lord? He said, you don't have to be lost. I've made a way where you can be saved. But you're going to have to come to me. I came down from heaven to earth. But you're going to have to come to me now. And if you will, I'll save your soul. And in baptism, you can be washed white as snow. And you can be raised a new person and a new man. And when you do that, you will say, I saw the Lord. And all who observe will say, did you see that? If we can help, why don't you come while we stand and while we